There are places on this earth that do not merely exist. They persist. They remain long after the maps change, long after roads bend away, long after names fall out of mouths and become dust. A house can be like that, not simply timber and stone, but a kind of memory made solid. You may have walked past one without noticing, a structure too quiet, too still, too separate from the living world. You may have felt it in your chest, that faint pressure, as if the air had turned heavy in a space no larger than a doorway. You may have told yourself it was nothing, whether fatigue, imagination. But the body knows. The body recognizes what the mind tries to deny. And there is one house, one manor, whose name has survived only as a bruise in the local tongue. A place that even skeptics describe with a pause. A place spoken of in fragments, as if the full sentence might invite something back. Ravencroft Manor, a name like a crow's wing folding shut. It stood beyond the last proper lane, where hedges grew wild and the trees leaned inward as if conferring. It stood on land that drank sunlight and returned only shadow. And in the years when the Ravencrofts lived there, the village nearby learned to measure time in a strange way. Not by seasons, not by harvests, but by how far the family withdrew and how the house changed its face. Because the Ravencrofts were not always a nightmare. Once, they were a pride. They hosted winter balls with music that spilled into the snow. They commissioned portraits and donated to the chapel. Their carriages rolled through town like black swans across a pale lake. Then something turned. Not suddenly, not in a single dramatic night, but slowly, like rot. Letters stopped arriving. Guests stopped being invited. Windows were shuttered in the day. Servants were replaced so often that no one could recall their names. And around the edges of ordinary life, fear began to grow. Not fear of an event, fear of a presence. And then, in time, the Ravencrofts vanished. Not one or two, all of them. No funeral bells, no bodies, no public scandal to explain it. The family name simply fell out of the official world, as if history itself had looked away. But some things do not end when a record stops. Some things continue in the damp corners of memory, in the stain on stone, in the way a certain road is never taken after sundown. Tonight, we do not merely tell a story. We walk toward a door that has been closed for a very long time, and we listen. Because if the Ravencroft family is forgotten by the world, the house is not. When you look back far enough, every family begins as a rumor, a name spoken across a table, a bargain made in the hush after prayer, a signature on parchment that smells faintly of smoke. The earliest mention of Ravencroft appears not in a grand ledger, but in a small, brittle church document, something half administered and half confessed. A note about land granted to a man whose service to the crown was considered quiet yet indispensable. Quiet services, indispensable to whom? The village did not ask. Villages rarely do. Survival teaches people to accept what comes from above. And so the Ravencrofts rose, not like heroes, but like ivy. They acquired the hilltop estate that would become their manor. They drained the marshy ground. They laid stone foundations. They planted a grove of yews along the path, trees traditionally used in graveyards, trees that thrive where other life struggles. In time, the house grew. It became Ravencroft Manor, tall, angular, and stern. Not welcoming in the way some homes are, not warm. Its architecture seemed less like comfort and more like defiance, as though it had been built to withstand something. And in the first generations, the family played their role well. They were patrons of artisans. They endowed the chapel with a new bell. Their winter gatherings became local legend. Candles everywhere, chandeliers like captured stars, music threading through hallways as if the very walls had learned to sing. There is a particular kind of romance people attached to old wealth, especially in rural places. A fairy tale gloss, a willingness to believe that the powerful are also elegant. But fairy tales are not the truth. They are the mask the truth sometimes wears to get closer. Because even in those early years, there were odd details that did not fit the glittering portrait. First, the graves, not the village graves. The Ravencrofts did not bury their dead in common earth. They created a private cemetery behind the manor, enclosed by iron fencing that never rusted properly, as if the metal was treated with something other than oil. The headstones there were said to be simple, no grand epitaphs, no displays of mourning, just names, just dates, and sometimes, if you believed the oldest villagers, the dates did not always make sense. A child listed as living only a week, yet no one remembered a funeral. A woman who died in winter, yet the ground would have been too hard to dig. The second detail, the servants. In prosperous households, servants become invisible in the best way. Stable, familiar, part of the routine. At Ravencroft Manor, they came and went like fog. A maid might be seen in the market once, pale and quiet, eyes downcast, and then never seen again. A footman might appear at the chapel, stiff-backed and silent, and then vanish as if swallowed by the manor's corridors. The village assumed, naturally, that servants were dismissed, or moved on, or found better work. But there is a difference between leaving and disappearing. And the third detail, the detail that pricked at superstition like a needle, was the sound. On certain nights, the villagers heard music from the manor when no guests were present. Not loud, not celebratory, just a thin thread of melody, floating over the hills like a lullaby meant for someone who could not sleep. And if you followed the sound too long, some said, you'd feel it change. You'd feel it slip from music into something else, a kind of trembling, like a voice trying not to cry. Years passed, decades. The Ravencrofts married into other families, as noble lines tend to do. But they kept a curious habit. Their most important unions, those that decided inheritance, happened within a narrow circle of blood. Cousins, second cousins. A family tree pruned so aggressively it began to resemble a cage. There are many reasons a family might do this: pride, paranoia, tradition, fear of outsiders. But there is another reason too, one rarely spoken aloud. Sometimes a family guards not just wealth, but a secret that cannot survive scrutiny. By the time the story reaches the generation most remembered, the generation that would vanish, the manor had become something else entirely. Still grand, yes. Still imposing, but its grandeur had hardened. Its gardens grew less tended. Statues cracked and were not repaired. Windows stayed shuttered even in mild weather. The yew grove thickened, darkening the path like an evergreen corridor leading to a mouth. This was the era of Edmund Ravencroft, the patriarch most often named in surviving whispers. Edmund was educated, polished, and spoken of with a kind of wary respect. He rode into town rarely, but when he did, he carried himself like a man who believed his family's history was not merely important, but untouchable. They say his wife, Lenora Ravencroft, was beautiful in a way that unsettled people. Not because she was cruel, but because she seemed distant from ordinary emotion. Her smile arrived a moment late. Her gaze lingered too long. In conversation, she spoke as if reciting rather than sharing. And they had children. At least, that is what the records suggest. But the children were rarely seen. The village children would sometimes gather near the estate boundary, daring one another to approach the iron gate. They would whisper about a pale boy in an upper window, watching them. They would point at a girl who sometimes walked the garden path at dusk, always in white, always alone. And then the rumors began. Not yet about monsters, not yet about ghosts, but about rules. Rules the Ravencrofts followed inside their house. One rumor said no mirrors were permitted in certain corridors. Another said the family ate meals in silence on specific nights, as though listening for something. A third, spoken only by the oldest women, claimed that on the first new moon of each winter, the manor's lights burned until dawn, and no one in the village slept well. As if the night had teeth, the chapel priest, a man named Father Hallow, attempted to call on the Ravencrofts in those years. It was his duty, he said, to ensure the spiritual health of all parishioners. He returned from the manor twice with a face like chalk. He did not speak of what he saw. He only told his congregation, in a sermon that trembled, that some doors should remain closed, and some sins were so old they had learned to wear the clothing of tradition. That sermon did not last long in public memory. People forget uncomfortable warnings, but certain phrases survive like splinters. Some sins are so old they wear the clothing of tradition. Then there was the storm. Every Gothic tale has a storm, doesn't it? But this one was recorded, real enough to be marked in local journals. A week of black clouds and relentless rain. Trees snapped. The river swelled beyond its banks. The road to Ravencroft Manor washed out in places, turning the estate into an island of stone and shadow. During this storm, something happened at the manor, something that would later become the first true fracture in the Ravencroft facade. A servant fled, not dismissed, not transferred, fled. He came into the village late at night, soaked to the bone, shoes worn through as if he'd run over gravel for miles. He was young, barely a man, and he collapsed near the chapel steps. When villagers tried to help him, he screamed, not in pain, in terror. Father Hallow brought him inside and gave him dry clothes, a blanket, warm broth. The boy, his name was Tomas. According to those who later spoke of it, clutched the edge of the table, as if it were the only real thing left in the world. He refused to say what had happened, not at first, and then, in a moment when the wind hit the chapel windows hard enough to make the glass shudder, he whispered a sentence that turned the room cold. They don't bury them. Silence followed, the kind of silence that feels like a body holding its breath. Father Hallow asked him, gently, who? Tomas stared at the floorboards like he expected them to open. The ones that die, he said. They don't take them to the ground. They take them down. Down. A simple word, but the way he said it made it feel like a staircase descending beneath sanity. Someone asked, foolishly, what he meant. Tomas's mouth worked, as if the words were stuck. And then he did something that convinced the room he was not lying. He began to pray. Not a calm prayer, not a ritual, a frantic, desperate prayer, like a man trying to keep something from hearing him. After that night, Tomas disappeared. Some claim the Ravencrofts came and took him back. Others claim he ran. A few say he drowned himself in the river. But the oldest villagers will look at you over the rim of their cup and say the same thing. The house doesn't let go of what it touches. And that became the village's new way of speaking about Ravencroft Manor. Not as a property, not as a residence, as a living thing, a mouth, a memory, a hunger. The following months were worse. The manor's gates stayed shut. A black cloth was tied around the iron bars, a sign of mourning, according to some traditions. But no funeral announcements were made. No bells rang. The Ravencrofts simply withdrew further, and the world outside them continued as best it could, pretending not to notice the shape of fear growing on the hill. Yet fear has a way of demanding details, and details began to leak out through overheard conversations, through the trembling words of those who had worked there, through the half-sensical rumors traded in the market. There were mentions of a basement that was not on the house plans, of a corridor behind the library that led somewhere it should not, of a locked room where the air smelled of iron and wet stone, of a lullaby Lenora Ravencroft sang, not to soothe a child, but to calm something restless behind the walls. People tried to laugh it off. They tried to make it into a story that could be told easily, a ghost tale for winter evenings. But there is a difference between a story told for entertainment and a story told to survive. And by the end of that year, the villagers no longer dared their children to approach the Ravencroft gates. They no longer walked the road that passed too near the yew grove. And if you asked them why, they did not say because of ghosts. They said simply, because something inside that house is waking up. If Ravencroft Manor was a body, then blood was its religion. Not love, not faith, not even power. Blood. The Ravencrofts believed, truly believed, that something essential passed through lineage untouched by time. That memory, will, and obligation were carried not in books or vows, but in the dark, intimate inheritance of flesh. And so the family tree did not branch outward. It curled inward. Marriage records from the period are incomplete, but what survives paints a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Ravencrofts married into a small, repeating circle of names, families that appeared once or twice, and then vanished entirely, as if absorbed. Cousins married cousins. Second cousins married closer than comfort allowed. And when outsiders did marry in, they rarely remained long. Some died young. Some fell ill. Some simply disappeared from all mention, as though their existence had been edited out of the story. The Ravencrofts did not speak of these things publicly. In fact, they spoke very little at all. By the time Edmund Ravencroft assumed control of the estate, the family had adopted a kind of ceremonial silence. Visitors described meals eaten with minimal conversation, questions answered politely but briefly, no laughter that lingered too long, as if sound itself needed to be rationed. Inside the manor, life followed a structure invisible to outsiders, but rigidly enforced within. There were rules not written down, but learned early. Children were taught them before they could read. Servants were warned on their first day, sometimes with kindness, sometimes with fear. Do not open certain doors. Do not enter the west wing after dusk. Do not light candles in the lower corridors unless instructed. And above all, do not ask what lies beneath the house. The house had a foundation deeper than stone. This much is known because of the architecture. Ravencroft Manor sat on a hill that should not have allowed extensive underground construction. The soil was dense, the rock stubborn. And yet, records from a traveling mason, one of the few craftsmen to ever work beneath the manor, mention substructures of unusual depth. Plural, not a cellar, not a wine vault, but levels, descending spaces that did not appear on any official plan. The mason never finished his work. He was paid in advance, escorted from the estate before dawn, and later told the village that the ground beneath Ravencroft Manor felt wrong. Not unstable, not unsafe, wrong, as if it resisted being shaped, as if it remembered something older than stone. Inside the family, this was not considered a problem. It was considered a responsibility. The Ravencrofts spoke, among themselves, of inheritance duties, of burdens passed down, not as punishment, but as obligation. Edmund Ravencroft reportedly told his eldest son that to be born into the family was to be chosen. Chosen for what was never explained. But Lenora Ravencroft, quiet, distant Lenora, kept the rituals. She was the keeper of nights. Every household has a rhythm, and Ravencroft S was dictated by the dark. Lenora knew which nights required silence, which nights required light, which nights required song. It was she who sang the lullaby the villagers sometimes heard drifting from the hill. Not a cheerful tune, not even a sad one. It was repetitive, circular, built on notes that never quite resolved, as if the melody itself were trapped. Servants described hearing it echo through the corridors long after Lenora's voice had stopped. And when the song ended, doors were locked. Children were gathered, and the house was left to listen. Those children, those Ravencroft heirs, grew up pale and inward, not stupid, not unkind, but distant. Their eyes lingered where others did not. They flinched at sounds no one else heard. They knew things they had never been taught. One governess, dismissed after less than a year, claimed the youngest daughter asked her, quite calmly, what it felt like to die. When the governess laughed nervously and asked why, the child replied, because some of us don't get to. That governess left the next morning. Not all servants fled. Some stayed. Some became devoted in a way that defied reason. These were the ones who spoke of the house as if it were a master in its own right. They cleaned certain rooms with reverence. They avoided certain corridors, not out of fear, but respect. They spoke to the walls when they thought no one was listening. And then there were the nights of instruction. These occurred when a Ravencroft child reached a particular age, usually between 12 and 14. On those nights, the child would be taken downstairs by Edmund and Lenora together. No servants accompanied them. The doors would be locked. The candles would burn low. And by morning, the child would return changed, not injured, not ill, changed. Some became withdrawn, barely speaking afterward. Others became strangely calm, as if a terrible uncertainty had finally been resolved. One boy, Edmund's second son, was overheard telling a servant, weeks after his night of instruction, "It's hungry, but it listens." The servant reported this. The servant was dismissed. The family explained nothing. And the village, though uneasy, continued to coexist with the hilltop shadow. People told themselves that wealth made people strange, that old families had old habits, that what happened behind stone walls was not their concern, until concern came looking for them. It began with the animals. Sheep refused to graze near the yew grove. Dogs whined and pulled away from the road to the manor. Birds avoided the trees around the estate, leaving them eerily silent even in spring. Then the water changed. The stream that ran downhill from Ravencroft Manor grew cloudy on certain mornings. Not dirty, just dull, as if light itself avoided it. Fish disappeared. The miller downstream complained of a metallic taste. And then people began to dream. Not everyone, but enough that patterns emerged. Dreams of corridors that went on too long. Dreams of doors breathing. Dreams of standing in a room where the walls whispered names, their names. One woman woke screaming that something beneath the earth was learning to speak. She had never set foot in Ravencroft Manor. At the center of all this stood Edmund Ravencroft, increasingly withdrawn, increasingly severe. He was seen riding into town once during this period, thinner than before, his eyes ringed with exhaustion. When asked after his family, he replied only, "We endure." Endurance. That word appears again and again in what little correspondence survives. Endurance, not happiness. Endurance, not salvation. Endurance, as if the Ravencrofts believed that survival itself was the point, no matter the cost. And then came the first death that could not be hidden. Not a servant, not a distant relation, a Ravencroft child. The eldest daughter, bright-eyed, quiet, often seen in white, fell ill suddenly. The illness was never named. No doctor was summoned from town. Instead, the manor's gates were shut tight. Black cloth hung once more, and the lullaby was sung every night for a week. When the girl did not appear again, villagers assumed the worst. They waited for funeral bells. They waited for the hearse. They waited for the body to be carried down the hill. None of it happened. Instead, Edmund Ravencroft appeared at the gate one morning and announced that his daughter had gone to her rest. Gone where? No answer. That was when Father Hallow returned to the manor for the final time. He went alone. He did not carry holy water. He did not carry a cross. He carried a look of grim certainty. What happened inside Ravencroft Manor that day is known only through what Father Hallow wrote afterward in a letter never sent, found years later among his effects. He described the house as listening. He described the air in the lower corridors as thick, wet, and warm, like breath. He described a door beneath the stairs that pulsed faintly, as if something behind it had a heartbeat. He wrote of Lenora, standing beside that door, singing softly, and he wrote one sentence that would become legend. This family is not cursed. They are caretakers. Father Hallow never returned to Ravencroft Manor again. Within a month, he resigned his post and left the village entirely. The children of Ravencroft continued to grow, continued to learn, continued to descend on nights that no calendar marked. And somewhere beneath the house, something continued to feed, not always on blood, not always on flesh, but on proximity, on memory, on lineage. Because whatever lived below Ravencroft Manor did not want strangers. It wanted family. There is a moment in every long-buried horror when the quiet ends. Not with an explosion, not with a scream, but with a change in the air. Those who lived near Ravencroft Manor would later say they felt it days before it happened. A pressure behind the eyes, a heaviness in the chest, sleep that came too easily or not at all. Animals restless, children waking from dreams they could not describe. The hill itself seemed to lean closer to the village. The first sign was the storm. It arrived without ceremony, rolling in low and slow, clouds pressing down like a lid. The wind did not howl, it murmured. Rain fell in long, steady sheets that erased the road to the manor inch by inch. By the third day, Ravencroft Manor was cut off completely. No one could go up. No one could come down. The villagers told themselves this was a mercy. Inside the house, the rules changed. Windows were sealed, shutters barred, fires kept burning even during daylight hours. Servants were dismissed or confined to the lower quarters, depending on whose account you believe. Edmund Ravencroft gathered his family in the great hall on the fourth night of the storm. The portraits watched from the walls, generations of faces rendered in oil and shadow, all sharing the same narrow eyes. Lenora stood beside him, her hands folded, her expression unreadable, and the children, grown now, or nearly, stood in a half circle, silent, pale, already bracing for what they knew was coming. Because they had been taught. This was not the first time the house had demanded attention, but it was the first time it had demanded more. The journal found decades later, its pages warped by damp, its ink smeared like bruises belonged to Edmund Ravencroft. In it, he wrote not like a madman, but like a man running out of options. It is restless. The intervals grow shorter. It no longer sleeps when we sing. The lullaby failed on the fifth night. Lenora sang until her voice cracked, until blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. The melody echoed through the corridors, down the staircases, into the deep places beneath the house. But the house did not calm. It stirred. Servants reported hearing movement below the floors, not footsteps, but shifting, as though something vast were adjusting itself in discomfort. Doors trembled in their frames. Candles guttered, even without wind. One servant, a woman who had been with the family for nearly 20 years, locked herself in the pantry and prayed until her voice gave out. She was found the next morning alive, but unable to speak. The children were taken downstairs that night. All of them. Edmund's journal stops naming names at this point. He refers to them only as the necessary. They descended the hidden staircase behind the library. Torches casting warped shadows on walls slick with moisture. The air grew warmer with each step, thicker, carrying the smell of iron and old stone. Below the lowest cellar, below what any house should have, lay the chamber. No one described it the same way twice. Some said it was circular. Some said it had no corners at all. Some said the walls moved when you weren't looking directly at them. What all accounts agree on is this: the chamber was alive. Not in the way a creature is alive, but in the way an organ is alive. Responsive, sensitive, hungry. The thing beneath Ravencroft Manor had grown with the house, had shaped itself around the family's presence. It had learned their voices, their blood, their rhythms, and now it wanted what it had always been promised. The first scream came just after midnight. It rolled down the hill like thunder, long and layered, as though more than one throat were crying out at once. The village woke. People sat upright in bed, hearts pounding, the sound crawling through their bones. Dogs began barking, then whining, then fell silent one by one. The second scream followed, shorter, sharper, closer to human. Lights appeared in windows across the village as people gathered, afraid to go outside, afraid not to. And then the screaming multiplied, not in volume, but in texture. High voices, low voices, voices that broke mid-cry into something else. Sounds that started as words and dissolved into raw noise. Someone shouted that the manor was burning. It was. The house remained dark. The screaming went on for hours. There were pauses, terrifying pauses, where the village held its breath, hoping it was over. And then it would begin again, louder, closer, more desperate. One man swore he heard his own name. Another claimed the screams were echoing from beneath the ground, not from the house itself. No one went up the hill, not even the brave, not even the foolish, because something in those sounds made it clear. This was not a thing that could be interrupted. Inside the manor, Edmund Ravencroft wrote his final words. We failed. It no longer accepts substitutions. It knows the difference now. The screams reached a peak just before dawn. A single sound rose above the rest, a tearing noise, like stone being pulled apart. Then silence, not gradual, not fading, absolute. The storm broke shortly afterward. The rain slowed, then stopped. Clouds thinned, allowing pale morning light to touch the hill for the first time in days. Smoke did not rise from the manor. Movement did not resume. The house simply stood, waiting. The villagers did not approach immediately. They watched from a distance, hours passing, the quiet stretching unnaturally long. Birds did not return. Wind did not stir the trees near the estate. Finally, near midday, a small group made the climb. The gates were open. Inside, Ravencroft Manor was untouched. The great hall was orderly. Candles burned down to stubs, but had not spilled wax. Furniture stood upright. No signs of struggle. The dining table was set for breakfast. Food sat untouched. The servants' quarters were empty. The family bedrooms were empty. Beds were warm. But the Ravencrofts were gone. All of them. In the lower corridors, the walls bore marks that had not been there before. Deep grooves, not made by tools, not made by human hands. And beneath the house, behind the door Father Hallow had described, there was only collapse. Stone fallen inward, earth sealed shut, as if whatever had been there had either retreated or finished feeding. The authorities recorded it as a disappearance, a tragedy, an unsolved mystery. They sealed the manor. They posted warnings. They told the village it was safe. But no one who had heard the screams believed that, because even in silence, the hill felt wrong. And some nights, on the edge of sleep, people swore they could hear something far below the earth, digesting. A house should empty when its people are gone. That is the natural order. Rooms lose their warmth. Dust settles. Silence becomes ordinary. A place transitions from lived in to abandoned. Ravencroft Manor refused that transition. In the days following the disappearance, officials sealed the estate. Locks were changed. Notices were nailed to the gates. The road was marked unsafe, the building declared unstable. But those who approached the hill, even weeks later, said the house felt occupied. Not by footsteps, not by voices, by attention. As if something behind the windows was aware of being observed. The first official inspection took place 12 days after the night of screams. 3 men entered the manor in daylight, carrying lanterns and notebooks, expecting rot, collapse, or at least disorder. They found none of it. The house was immaculate. Furniture stood precisely where it always had. Rugs were brushed. Curtains hung straight. Even the portraits, those narrow-eyed ancestors, looked recently cleaned, their gazes sharp and watchful. One inspector noted something unsettling in his report. The house shows signs of maintenance that could not have occurred after the family's disappearance. Yet the work is fresh. They dismissed it as imagination. They should not have. The deeper they moved into the manor, the more the sense of wrongness intensified. Sound behaved strangely, footsteps muffled, voices echoing where they should not. Lantern light bent in corners, shadows stretching beyond their sources. Then they reached the lower corridors. Here, the air grew warmer, damp, alive. One man turned back immediately, claiming nausea. Another refused to go further, insisting the walls were breathing. The third continued. He was the one who discovered the marks, not scratches, impressions, as if something vast had pressed against the stone repeatedly, shaping it over time. The rock was smoother there, worn not by friction, but by contact. That man would later say, in a private letter, that the house did not feel empty. It felt sated. After that inspection, access to the manor was restricted further. But curiosity, like hunger, is not easily denied. Over the years, others entered: trespassers, scholars, clergy, foolhardy youths, those seeking proof and those seeking absolution. They did not all leave. One group, 3 university men, broke in during the summer nearly 20 years later. They came prepared, convinced the stories were exaggerations. Only 2 returned. They claimed their companion panicked in the lower halls and ran ahead. They heard him screaming briefly, then nothing. They never found him. The manor was searched. Nothing, not even a body. After that, the locals stopped calling it a disappearance. They called it acceptance. The hauntings began subtly. Lights in windows on moonless nights, curtains moving without wind. The lullaby, Lenora's lullaby, heard faintly, as if sung by the house itself. People walking past the hill reported a sensation of being counted. Steps matching theirs from inside the walls. Dreams intensified, not dreams of the house, dreams from it. Dreamers described standing in rooms that rearranged themselves, corridors looping back on themselves, doors that opened into spaces that were far too large to exist beneath a single manor. And always, beneath it all, the sense of something enormous and patient. Listening. The journals recovered during this period confirmed what Father Hallow had feared. The Ravencrofts had not discovered the thing beneath the house. They had inherited it. The earliest entries, written in a cramped, archaic hand, spoke of a pact. Not a summoning, not a ritual, but an agreement made long ago by the family's founder. Protection, prosperity, endurance, in exchange for stewardship. The thing beneath the hill was not evil in the way stories like to frame such beings. It was ancient, territorial, bound to place. It required familiarity, blood, memory, and it did not tolerate neglect. Each generation of Ravencrofts had been taught how to soothe it, feed it just enough, keep it dormant. But over time, something changed. The house grew larger. The family grew smaller. The balance failed. By Edmund's generation, there were not enough Ravencrofts left to sustain what lived below. The thing learned hunger not as need, but as desire, and desire sharpened its awareness. It learned to distinguish. It learned to prefer. The hauntings worsened as years passed. A caretaker hired by the county lasted less than a month. He reported hearing voices beneath the floorboards calling him by his childhood nickname, a name no one in the village knew. A woman researching the site claimed the mirrors reflected rooms behind her that did not exist. A priest attempting a blessing fled the manor in tears, insisting the house was not possessed. It was inhabited. And still, the structure did not decay. Roofs elsewhere collapsed within a decade. Ravencroft Manor endured storms, snow, neglect, and time with unnatural resilience. As if something within it refused to let the walls fall, because walls were necessary. By the time the manor was officially abandoned, declared unfit, unsafe, forbidden, the village had already made peace with its presence. Children were warned never to approach the hill. Names of the Ravencrofts were no longer spoken aloud. But the dreams continued, and sometimes, on certain nights, the lullaby returned not as sound, but as pressure, vibrating behind the eyes. Those who heard it felt compelled to walk, to climb, to return something that had been taken. One winter, decades later, a fire broke out in the nearby forest. Flames approached the hill, threatening to consume Ravencroft Manor at last. They stopped, not naturally. The wind shifted sharply, pushing the fire away in a perfect arc around the estate. The manor remained untouched. After that, no one spoke of destroying it again, because it had become clear the house was no longer a structure containing something monstrous. The house was the monument, a shell, a memory, a boundary keeping something old from spreading further. And boundaries, once broken, cannot always be repaired. Time does what fire could not. It wears things down slowly, patiently, stone softened by rain, wood eaten by insects, memory thinned by generations who learn not to ask. By the time the modern world crept close to Ravencroft Manor, the house had become a ruin in name only. The roof sagged, but did not fall. The walls cracked, but held. The windows were empty, yet never truly dark. Trees encroached on the grounds, their roots wrapping around the foundations like fingers reclaiming a pulse. Ivy climbed the outer walls, but never crossed certain thresholds, stopping abruptly as if repelled by an invisible line. The manor endured, and in endurance it called. Urban explorers were the first to test the silence. They came with cameras, flashlights, and the careless confidence of those who believe stories lose their power when filmed. Their footage, what little survived, shows familiar things at first: collapsed staircases, dust-heavy rooms, peeling wallpaper. But as they moved deeper, the recordings became erratic. Audio distortion without cause. Lights dimming when pointed at doorways. Walls that seemed closer than they had been moments before. One video ends abruptly with a whispered sentence, barely audible beneath static. It knows we're not family. The group left shaken, convinced the house was unstable. They were wrong. Others came later, historians, skeptics, thrill seekers. Some stayed only minutes, overcome by nausea or panic. Some lasted longer, convinced they were alone, unaware of how carefully they were being measured. A modern researcher uncovered one final Ravencroft document hidden inside a false wall near the old library. It was not a journal. It was a warning, written in a steadier hand than Edmund's final entries. It suggested the truth the family had never spoken aloud. The Ravencrofts were not victims. They were buffers. What lived beneath the house was bound to blood, not walls. The manor was built not to imprison it, but to contain its influence. The family existed as a living boundary, feeding it just enough to keep it dormant, keeping it familiar, keeping it local. When the family vanished, the boundary weakened. But the thing did not leave. It adapted. Modern encounters confirm this in subtle ways. Instruments malfunction near the lower ruins. Sound behaves oddly underground. People report feeling watched, not hunted, not threatened, but assessed. As if the house is waiting for something specific. Not trespassers, not believers, heirs, because blood remembers, even diluted, even scattered, even centuries later. Some genealogists have suggested that distant Ravencroft descendants may still live unaware, ordinary lives, ordinary homes, ordinary dreams. And yet, some people report nightmares that feel inherited, dreams of stairs descending forever, dreams of a song that calms something vast, dreams where a house recognizes them. Ravencroft Manor remains officially abandoned. Unofficially, it is avoided. No one builds there. No one reclaims the land. The hill remains untouched, a blank space in development plans, a quiet omission in local history, because the village learned something the world often forgets. Some horrors are not meant to be destroyed. They are meant to be held, and holding requires sacrifice. If the Ravencrofts were monsters, it was not because they fed something in the dark. It was because they believed they were the last ones who could. Tonight, the manor still stands, listening, waiting not for victims, but for the return of duty. The story of the Ravencroft family is not a ghost story. Ghosts are what remain when something ends. This is a story about continuity, about bargains that outlive the people who make them, about traditions that harden into cages, about the quiet terror of realizing that survival itself can become a curse passed from parent to child. The Ravencrofts did not vanish because they were punished. They vanished because they were no longer enough. And the house remembers that. So if you ever find yourself drawn to a place you cannot explain, if a melody you have never heard feels strangely familiar, if you dream of rooms that feel like inheritance rather than imagination, be careful. Some legacies are not written in wills. Some are written in blood, stone, and patience. And some houses never stop waiting.